Hey there gang, welcome back. Got an Eastman here on the bench today. This is a model T145S indecipherable. No, actually I do have a bone to pick with Eastman, not so much with the model numbers, it's the serial numbers. Because they've somehow come up with a system of recording that is worse than the early years of Gibson, if you can believe it. It's incomprehensible to me that a company that wants to market high-end guitars in the 21st century doesn't have an easy online way of figuring out when something was made. You can look it up in various message boards and get kind of hearsay posts, but apparently, you can email Eastman themselves and they won't be able to tell you, and Eastman dealers can't even tell you when a certain guitar was made, except by going back through their shipping invoices and trying to correlate that with various serial numbers in different years. So it's kind of a mess. Anyway, rant over. This guy is a fully hollow thin line, single pickup, really nicely made, and you can see that it's been through the wars. There's an awful lot of play wear on this guy. And similar to that SG I did a few weeks back, we're going to add a pickup in the bridge position this time. And what do you know? It's another de-armament. So I'm going to have to find a way to suspend this in the right spot, but we're not sure whether this is going to be the be-all, end-all pickup for this guitar. If it doesn't work out, it'll get swapped for a humbucker. And so I'm going to try and make it easy on future me. I'll make a surround for this that's the same size as a standard humbucker ring, because I'm going to have to cut away some of this nice ebony pickguard here to make it fit, and I really only want to do that once if I have to. The wiring harness is going to have to come out, which is always fun in thin line guitars, as you can imagine. Just noticing that the jack is actually a little loose on this anyway, so I'm actually going to change that jack. And I'm going to put a switch over here on this side of the F-hole to control the pickups. There's a few other things that need doing along the way. We're going to move the upper strap button. I'm going to fill some dings on the back of the neck and smooth that down a bit. And we'll see about making a new bridge top that will slightly widen the string spacing a little bit and also intonate nicely for the player's preferred tuning. Sound good? Let's continue. Just checking out the string spacing here at the saddle. It's around 54 millimeters, 2 1/8-ish, which is pretty typical. It's a little wider than some. This player would like the guitar set up so it feels more akin to his acoustic instruments, and he plays National Resophonics. Those have a very wide spacing actually as they come from the factory. It's usually around 59 millimeters or 2 5/16. So anything we can gain here would go a long way to making it more comfortable for him. A lot of that depends on the spacing of the front pickup here. Just checking this high E string here, we're hugging the outside edge of the screws, which is okay. On the bass side, we've got plenty of room to move that over, like 2.5 millimeters, so there's a lot to be gained. The other thing is how the strings lie in relation to the sides of the fingerboard. Because he plays slide, it's nice if the high E or D or whatever it's going to be is close to the edge of the board so that you're not bumping into it with the slide as you're moving up and down. So that's good. It's set up nicely in that regard. The bottom of the bridge appears to have been either glued or maybe they're using a double-sided tape that's kind of messy to stick this in position, so that it might not be able to move that very much. I did check out the intonation. It's actually not bad for standard tuning right now. If anything, the low strings could actually come forward a little bit, so if I make a new bridge topper, we'll take that into consideration and we'll get that bang on. Just sort of approximate the position here of the pickup and measure the height of the strings off the top. In the front, on the bass side, it's around 21. The treble's around 20. And the back side, it's about 23. The bass side's around 24. Okay, useful information. The tailpiece was grounded, which is good. There's a hole for me to stick another wire through. As I've mentioned before, it's always a good idea to make sure that the pickup actually works before you start cutting up a guitar to accommodate it. I'm also checking out the polarity here by pressing the steel ruler across the poles. In this case, it's a positive polarity. You can see that the numbers jump upwards when it makes contact. This will become important later on. I'm drilling out the little brass rivets that hold the pickup onto its backing plate. You can see I've got it taped up to make sure none of the stuff gets inside. Here's the quick little router jig I made up for the last dearmament I installed a couple of weeks ago, and it seems like this one will work again, although in this case it's actually a little bit looser than the previous pickup. It wobbles around a little bit too much for my liking. I'll cut a strip of veneer of the appropriate width, and I'll glue that to the inside of the jig and reduce its width by about 1/2 millimeter or so. I spent some time figuring out exactly where that pickup is going to live. Turning my attention to the pick guard, I used a marking gauge to scribe out the lines for the cutout in a square. Then I went ahead and I drilled a small hole, 5/16 of an inch, in the corner there to match the radius of the pickup ring. Sawed that out using a jeweler's saw. Pared back closer to the line. And then finished off with a file to get things nice and crisp. I soften the edges with a little bit of sandpaper. Let's go ahead and take all the electronics out of this thing. Save all the screws. Don't lose those. And these are the smaller sized alpha pots, Asian made. They're fine. They're okay. We're just going to change them out for CTS pots though. I'm changing the location of the strap button from the back of the instrument below the heel up to the side, and in order to do that I have to glue in a support block on the inner surface, so I'm using my little guitar tuner clamp here to draw that block in using a guitar string. It'll hold it in place while the glue dries and give the screws some good support. Of course, the shaft diameter on the American pots is slightly larger than the Asian ones, so I have to remount those holes slightly so that they'll fit. I also need to determine the correct location for the switch. I'll mark that and I'll drill it, but again I'll drill slightly undersized and ream it to the final fit. There's less chance of damaging the edges of the finish that way. I've cut a piece of maple from which I'll make the pickup surround, and I'm just about to route out the center cavity here. It's not going to go all the way through. It'll be more like a tray, so that there's material underneath the pickup into which I can put the screws, and they're not going to go into the top. I'll drill a hole for the wire. Now it's a question of sanding over the edges of the block and making them into a radius, and also softening the corners, trying my best to keep everything perpendicular or at right angles to each other. That fits in there pretty nicely. I need to fit the undersurface to the radius of the top. That can take some doing. I start off with sanding, and then I'll change to a card scraper to remove more material and gradually work my way down till the thing sits perfectly on the top. I'll stain it black, and then I'll shoot 3 or 4 coats of lacquer on it to give it some shine. Checking the polarity on that dearmament, when I touch the ruler to the top cover, you see that those numbers jump down before they normalize. That means this is in the opposite polarity from the neck pickup, which means they would be out of phase. A couple of ways of dealing with that. We figured the easiest was just to swap it out for a humbucker I had kicking around here, which is a Seymour Duncan 59 PAF style pickup, and you can see that the numbers go up, which means that these will be in phase. Okay, I've just been working on soldering up the new harness here. I started off by plotting out the positions of the holes in the guitar top and then transfer them to this piece of cardboard. It's kind of important. It keeps things where they need to be inside the guitar, so you don't have excess wire, because when you're trying to fish this harness around, you don't want it tangling up on itself. You have to remember when you do that the layout you trace on the top will be backwards. You'll have a mirror image when you come to wire it. So it really pays to remind yourself and label what component is where, because it's really easy to, put something in the wrong place. In this case, I got one volume, one tone, and the switch. And they sort of snake around the F-hole. And I have this extended little tail here for the jack as well. This design is a little more complicated because I've got the tone pot isolated to work on the bridge pickup only. And that means I've got to jump a wire from that pickup all the way over to the tone pot first and then onto the switch. So there's another wire involved. It really pays to take time and draw out the scheme first. Like, you basically have to when you're doing this kind of thing, just to make sure you know where stuff has got to go. The other thing you should think about if you want to work on hollow bodies is how much time it actually takes to move these components around in and out of the guitar. In this case, I'm going to actually run the bridge pickup, the wires over the top, out through the F-hole, because it might want to change down the road. But I'm also going to send the wires from the pots to the neck pickup as well, so it can be accessible through the hole in the top for the same reason. When you get into repair and you build up a clientele of regulars, you realize that some players just like to change things, just part of their makeup. I've got all these new components here wired up very neatly, and it would be a shame if I had to take the whole thing out again the next time I want to change a pickup. So, I mean, having the groups of wires organized with the shrink tubing keeps it all together and makes it easier to fish. And it also acts like a bit of a strain relief as well. But, you know, every time you've got to tug these things into position, you risk breaking a connection. And that increases every time you do it. So, here's the tip of the day. Whenever you can, try and make the pickup connections in a place that's accessible, like the pickup cavity, because it'll save you hours of moving this thing around in and out.
Going to do a little bit of touch-up work. I'll fill the hole from the previous strap button. Clip that off, let it dry, then cut it flush. On the back of the neck there's a series of sharp little divots which really are quite annoying when you run your thumb up the neck, so I'll take some time and fill those. Just add a little bit of color with a marker. There's very little finish on the back of this neck. When I went back to level these things and also take off some of the shine, it seems like there's only one coat of color and then maybe one sealer coat above it. It's one of the thinnest finishes I've ever felt on the neck. I have no idea how they managed to buff it. One quick little spray of accelerator here, and I'll wipe off most of the excess, and then some thin super glue on top, and build up a few layers of that, and then I'll be able to level it. Similarly, on the top of the guitar there were a couple of areas where the lacquer was chipping away, so I did the same treatment there. Didn't go crazy, but I did want to keep things sealed up so that it wasn't going to all flake off at some point. Before stuffing all these electronics into the guitar, it does pay to check and make sure it all works. The shape of the new humbucker's mount required me to remove a little bit of material around the central area where the screws are. So I sawed that out carefully and pared it back with a knife. Before installation, I took a second and put a piece of plastic drinking straw over the shaft on both the pots. You'll see why in a second. I always color in the tone pot too with some Sharpie. Especially in multi-pot designs, you can actually lose track of what's what in there. It's time to insert the harness, and you can also see that black ground wire which runs all the way back to the tailpiece. By pulling on it, and also a jack which I've inserted, I can pull these things towards where they need to go inside the guitar. First things first, I'll get the jack screwed in place. Here's where the straws come into play. I can use a small 1/8" dowel down through the hole, hook it into the straw, and it helps pull things up into the right location. And you can see that your little finger takes a real beating doing this, and by the end of the day it's got all kinds of weird marks on it. I find it's usually easier trying to get the spiked retaining washer on near the proper location rather than trying to drag all of the pots along through the body with those washers on there. They always fall off. So in this case, the straw helps for that as well. It's time to solder, or solder, the leads together here. Protect the top of the instrument from any splatter while doing this, because that could make a mess of things really quickly. We'll heat shrink the hot lead. And I'm using cable ties to kind of tie up any of the excess braided cable there so that there's nothing flopping around inside the guitar. That can be very annoying. For the grounding wire, I bend it over and make sure it's got good contact with the metal part of the tailpiece there, so the strings will be grounded. To lend extra support for the pick guard, I've made up a small block here which I'll glue to the underside, through which I'll run a screw. That'll go right into the pickup surround. Turning my attention to the bridge, I've got a block of ebony which I've planed to size. Here I'm establishing the top arching on it. Then I'll go ahead and mark out the string spacing for the outside strings, from which I can derive the spacing for the rest of them. And I'm taking a square here and I'm marking across the top surface of the bridge. This will help later on when I'm actually doing the carving, so I don't lose track of where the string should be. To hold the strings in the right spot while I work on the intonation, I'm filing a V-groove on the back edge of the saddle here. This will eventually get carved away, so this doesn't have to look presentable or anything. It just keeps them in the right spot. And I've got that B string there bent over at a right angle, which holds the string just high enough off the saddle that I can get a good clear tone, check out the octaves, and then mark off exactly where the intonation point should be. Now, this bridge is going to be designed to look like the old National or Valco style bridges. You've seen me make those before. They've got sort of a lightning bolt design to them. This player really likes them. In this case, however, the bridge base had been glued to the soundboard. Someone had come along and scraped off the lacquer there and stuck it right down, so I couldn't really move the bridge easily. So the shape here is not quite as elegant as some of these that I've made, but it's, you know, what needs to be done for proper intonation. It works. It's fine. I'm using a knife to mark out what will eventually be saw cuts. Ebony's quite hard, of course, kind of brittle, and it's possible to crack off the edges or corners if you don't have a good stopping place for your chisel cuts. So these are stop cuts. Chiseling, chiseling, chiseling. Half the time you're going against the grain, so it helps to make these sort of preliminary curls. Work your way down and try to figure out which way you should push the chisel to make it cut the cleanest. It's not always that easy. With the bridge all set up, I can position the pickup and fix it in place using some tenacious double stick tape. Got the de-armand wires attached and held in place with this little clip so nothing's flopping around. Going back to level out those areas where I did the super glue drop fills. I eventually took all the gloss off the back of the neck at the player's request. Several of the nut slots were too low, so I made a hardwood shim and glued it to the bottom of the nut. Got everything set up the way I like it. Alright, I think we're all set to go. That looks okay. If at some point we want to change that out for a humbucker, because this thing's already fit to the top so nicely, I can plane it down and it'll become a riser for the standard pickup ring without too much trouble. I hope he likes this one though. These de-armants have a sound all their own. Really interesting quality to them. So, pretty happy with the bridge too.